He wiped the sweat from the brows of children who never called him Dad. He set the table, patched the roof, and stretched every dollar just to keep their home together. But at the will reading, they didn't look at him. They didn't say his name. They only waited to divide the inheritance, as if he had never existed. And his wife, the woman he loved until her final breath, left him with just one line: "To my husband, I leave my gratitude." But then, a letter from the past surfaced, and they would all pay the price, not through rage, but through truth. If you've ever witnessed someone quietly sacrifice and be forgotten, stay until the very end. Don't forget to subscribe and join us for stories the world rarely dares to tell. Late afternoon. The last light of day streamed through the tall window of attorney Terence Holloway's office, casting long streaks of golden hue across the polished hardwood floor. The scent of worn leather from the vintage sofa mixed with the musty smell of old paper files, making the air feel heavy. In the very back row, Walter Evans sat alone. Black suit, dark tie, clean-shaven, shoes gleaming, everything about him was neat, like a man who once polished the photo frame on the mantel every morning, fixed the squeaky door no one asked him to, and quietly brewed coffee for the woman he only ever called by two words, his wife. Across from him, near the oak conference table, sat three people dressed in all black, but not a hint of mourning in sight. Vanessa Langford, with perfectly curled blonde hair, was scrolling through her phone as if waiting for the next TikTok outrage. Eric Langford, sharp-jawed and visibly irritated, kept checking his watch. Bryce Langford, lounging with legs crossed and arms draped, exuded the entitlement of someone who believed this reading of the will was simply a transfer of power. Not one of them looked at Walter. No nod, no greeting. None of the three children he had helped raise, protected and filled every gap left by their absent biological father. None of them called him Dad. Only cold, dismissive glances, like he was a worn-out piece of furniture in the old family home, ready to be discarded. Then attorney Terence Holloway walked in, carrying a thick stack of documents. His voice was low and steady as he began, "Thank you all for coming. We're here today to read the last will and testament of Mrs. Margaret Langford." Walter didn't move, but somewhere deep inside, something had begun to crack. The first sound in the room wasn't the attorney's voice. It was the tapping of Vanessa Langford's manicured nails on her phone screen. Tap, 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 like the ticking of an hourglass in the hands of someone just waiting for this whole ceremony to end so she could return to her glittering world, a world where there was no room for the quiet man sitting in the back. Walter Evans didn't hear it with his ears. He heard it in his chest. Each tap was like a heartbeat echoing with memories. Vanessa as a child, sobbing and clinging to her mother's leg on the elementary school playground. It wasn't Margaret who comforted her. It was Walter. He had picked her up, gently patted her back and whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy's here." And that day, she stopped crying, but today she wouldn't even glance his way. In the chair beside her, Eric Langford, the son who made mistake after mistake but was never truly punished, checked his watch for the fourth time in less than 10 minutes. Walter recognized the model, $17,500. Limited edition, probably bought with the very equity Walter once advised Margaret to hold on to, just in case the family ever fell on hard times. That just in case was now wrapped around the wrist of a man waiting for Walter to disappear from their lives. And Bryce, slouched in his chair, one arm draped over the back, the other holding a glass of water like he was attending a boardroom presentation. He glanced around the room, stretched his neck to scan the ebony bookshelf, then leaned over to whisper into Eric's ear, "Pretty sure the Cadillac's mine. Mom said she'd leave it to me." Walter heard every word, but said nothing. He had once wiped away Bryce's tears after the boy scraped his knee rollerblading, had spent 5 hours in the garage fixing that very same Cadillac, the one Bryce now claimed as mine. Walter had smiled once when Margaret said, "They'll grow up and understand someday." But maybe they only grew up. They never understood. Walter was not a man without emotions. He had simply trained them to stay silent. No sighs, no bitterness, just a hand resting on his knee, quietly clenching. That hand bore a scar, a faint line beneath his left wrist from the time he broke a glass pane while installing kitchen cabinets in Margaret's old home. No one noticed. No one asked. Just like no one ever looked at him or called him by name, the way they referred to him behind closed doors. Her man. Not husband, not father, not family. Just a footnote everyone felt free to skip. Attorney Terence Holloway cleared his throat, attempting to regain the room's attention, but Walter didn't need to hear the will to know where he stood. He had stood there for 25 years, on the doorstep of the family, but never once invited inside. Attorney Terence Holloway looked up from the thick black file, his voice lowering, almost as if he, too, could feel the heaviness hanging in the room. As confirmed by the decedent's wishes, I will now begin reading the official last will and testament of Mrs. Margaret Langford. The soft rustle of paper echoed in the silence. Walter didn't flinch, didn't blink, but inside every nerve stretched taut, waiting. And then, the first line came, slicing through the air like scissors tearing open a drawn curtain. I leave the lakeside vacation home in Vermont, including all furnishings, the flower garden and the boathouse, to my daughter Vanessa Langford. Vanessa looked up from her phone for the first time in 20 minutes. A smile flickered across her face, not of emotion, but of confirmation, like an investor hearing her stock just hit a new high. Walter said nothing, but in his mind that house was never just property. It was the place where he had poured buckets of cement under snowfall, where he alone had built the trellis for Margaret's beloved roses, where he had laid every stone along the path to the lake, one by one. He still remembered Margaret's gentle laugh behind him. No need to hire anyone, I've already got the best man for the job. And now, that home had been handed to someone who had never once touched a rake. The attorney continued without pause. All personal investment portfolios, including approximately $850,000 in stock holdings and dividend income from Langford Holdings, will be transferred to my son, Eric Langford. Walter glanced to his right. Eric gave a subtle nod, a smug smile forming as his fingers instinctively tugged his shirt cuff to reveal the luxury watch on his wrist, as if to say, "I deserve this." But Walter remembered. Eric had once dropped out of college, nearly forcing Margaret to sell the house to cover his student loans. And it was Walter who silently took out a lien against his retirement insurance to keep the boy in school for one more semester. No one ever knew, because Walter never told a soul. To Bryce Langford, I leave the heirloom jewelry collection, including the sapphire ring, the emerald hairpin, and the 1969 Cadillac, lovingly maintained over the years by Walter. Walter heard that, and something inside him clenched. That car was his weekend escape, the place he retreated to after arguments, after cold glances, after silent dinners with no invitation. He remembered bending under the chassis, oil-stained hands working with care. Not for Bryce, but because Margaret had once whispered, "That car holds a piece of my father's memory." And now it was a gift to the youngest son, a man who probably didn't even know how to pop the hood. Walter didn't cry, but his heart slowed, not because he wanted a share, but because every piece he had cherished had become spoils for those who had never preserved them. The attorney paused briefly, his voice steadier now, yet each word stabbed into the hollow of Walter's chest. To Gwendolyn Pierce, my cousin, I leave the antique porcelain set once displayed in the dining room. She always said she adored it during our family gatherings. Gwendolyn? Walter closed his eyes for a beat. The woman had visited exactly once in the past 10 years. Late to arrive, early to leave, had never washed a single glass, hadn't called Margaret even once. And him, he had lived beside Margaret for 25 years, driven her to every medical checkup, held her through sleepless nights mourning her father, shared her silences without judgment, without conditions, and yet still no name. Every line read was a fresh cut. No blood spilled, but each one slashed at the dignity of a man who gave everything and never once asked for anything in return. Attorney Terence Holloway paused for a beat, He pulled a final sheet from the dark leather file. It was unlike the others, shorter, thinner, containing only a single passage. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, not from fatigue, but because he understood. This moment would be unlike anything he had read before. The evening light had begun to slip beyond the window. Shadows stretched across the table. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then he read, "And finally, to my husband, Walter Evans, who stood by my side for the past 25 years. Walter lifted his head. For the first time. In that moment, all sound around him vanished. The hum of the air conditioner, Vanessa's clicking heels, even the ticking wall clock seemed to go silent. There was only Walter's heartbeat thudding loudly in his ears. His eyes shimmered as though his soul had just been summoned back from some dim, forgotten place. He had waited for this moment. Not for the inheritance, not for justice, just to be named. A part of him had hoped to hear, "I leave him the home we built with love," or "I leave him the savings we accumulated over the years." But instead, the will's closing words rang out, clean, sharp, polished like a well-honed blade. "I leave him my gratitude." Silence, a kind of silence not born of emotion, but of confusion, shock, and disbelief. Vanessa blinked, then smirked. Eric exhaled slowly, barely holding back a condescending laugh. Bryce leaned in to whisper something, but Walter didn't hear it. Because in his head, only one phrase echoed. "Gratitude? Is that all?" 25 years together. 25 years of fixing every nail, every pipe, every crack in the heart of a woman broken by her first marriage. 25 years of standing in the middle of 3 children who weren't his by blood, but whom he still called my kids, whom he raised as his own. And now, when everything worth counting had been divided, he was left with 2 words: gratitude. No deed, no shares, no private message, no sign that he had ever been flesh and blood in her life. Just a fading wisp of smoke that people wave goodbye to before it disappears. A chair scraped lightly across the floor, not Walter's. Eric leaned forward, whispering under his breath, but loud enough for Walter to hear. Guess he thought he was about to be a millionaire. Vanessa pressed her lips together in a smile, then murmured like venom. Mom really nailed it, gave him nothing, and still kept her image intact. Bryce exhaled, relieved, nodding. "So that's it, huh? We done here?" Walter said nothing. He sat there for a few more seconds. Then, gently removed his glasses. Wiped them with a silk cloth, a final act of dignity. No one noticed his eyes had reddened. No one saw his fingers trembling. Because even the deepest pain, he had always kept hidden. Just like all those years before, he stood, adjusted his collar, nodded faintly toward the attorney, not out of respect, but because Walter Evans was a man who still believed in courtesy, even when he'd been erased from his own story. Then he turned to leave. His shadow stretched long across the wooden floor, each step slow like a quiet stab from spine to heart. And before he walked out the door, he did only one thing. He lifted his hand to gently touch the corner of his eye. No one knew if it was a tear or just an itch. But at that very moment, something within him cracked and quietly began to burn. Walter Evans walked out of the will reading room like a shadow retreating from the very frame of his own life. No one walked him to the door. No one called after him. He passed through a long hallway where oil paintings hung quietly, as silent as the years he spent in the Langford household, present but unseen. Behind the heavy wooden doors now closed, the room had not yet dispersed. Vanessa laughed first, a sharp sound, like a glass of scotch over ice sliding down the throat of someone unfamiliar with bitterness. Thought he'd cry. Turns out he knows how to keep quiet. Eric nodded, arms crossed. Gotta admit, Mum was clever. Gave him exactly 2 words, gratitude, and cut him off clean, without looking cold-hearted. Bryce stretched his arms, letting out a long yawn. Told you from the start, he was just a long-term handyman who got the honorary title of husband. Nothing to mourn. Not one of them, the newly minted heirs of over $1 million, felt the need to offer a shred of grace to the man who once sweated under the sun and rain to build the very house they now planned to auction off next week. None of them knew that they had just stepped across a boundary Walter had never let anyone cross before. Downstairs, Walter stood at the elevator. Its stainless steel doors reflected his face clearly. Not angry, not broken, just empty. He stared at his own reflection, saw a man once labeled lucky to have married Margaret Langford. But deep down, Walter had long understood, the most dangerous thing in life isn't being abandoned. It's being kept around in a role no one truly wants you to play. Back upstairs, in a room still scented with expensive perfume and untouched coffee, Attorney Terence Holloway was staring at the will in his hands, a faint crease forming between his brows. He knew Margaret had instructed him to draft 2 separate versions of her will, but he also knew the second version was only to be opened with a direct written order, or a private letter, and that letter had yet to surface. Outside, Walter stepped onto the street. The early autumn air was crisp, but not as cold as the chill that had just been planted in his heart. Cars passed, strangers hurried by. Everything looked ordinary, except for one thing: he wasn't. Because for the first time in 25 years, he didn't just feel forgotten. He felt buried alive in the memory of someone he once called his wife. Standing on the stone-paved sidewalk, hands clenched inside his coat pockets, Walter heard something faint in the distance. A voice, a whisper, from the very room he had just left. He didn't need to turn around. He heard it clearly in his mind. "Guess he finally knows his place." Walter didn't respond. He just closed his eyes, took a long breath in. Then he walked away. Not fast, not rushed, but each step carried something heavier than loss, something silent and solid as stone. Inside a man who once believed that kindness would be enough. Walter Evans didn't go home, even though he had the key, even though his name had once been on the electricity bill, the water service, the insurance policy. But now that house, the one where he had painted every trim, fixed every outlet, belonged to someone who had never shed a single drop of sweat for it. Vanessa Langford. He didn't call a cab, didn't board a bus. He just walked, step by step, along the sidewalks of their old neighborhood where maple leaves had begun to fall, covering the ground in reds and golds. But to Walter, every color looked dull. He paused in front of the bakery he and Margaret used to visit every Sunday morning, now under new ownership. Past the cafe where he once proposed to her, now a sleek art gallery. Eventually he reached the intersection near the bank, where they had once gone to apply for a joint account. And there he stopped. The traffic light turned red. Pedestrians hurried across as soon as the green blinked. But Walter stood still, at the corner, as if unsure where to go. But in truth, he wasn't lost in direction. He was lost in belief. From somewhere deep inside him, a question surfaced. Slow, clear, sharp as a blade. Did Margaret ever truly choose me? A part of him wanted to dismiss it, to remember how she had once held him through painful, sleepless nights, how she called him the last good man left in the world, how she had gripped his hand at her father's funeral and whispered, "You're the only one I have left." But now those memories felt fragile, because if that love had been real, why did she leave him with only 2 words, gratitude? Not my final companion, not pillar of this family. No apology, no parting words, just a wave from afar. Walter clenched his fists, not from anger, not from any desire for revenge, but because he no longer knew who he was. He used to believe, you don't need recognition. Just live kindly, that's enough. But today, standing at the intersection of his life, he realized kindness unacknowledged becomes invisible. A gust of wind slipped through his coat. Walter raised a hand to adjust his collar, a small gesture, but one that felt like a final wall he put up to shield against the cold seeping into his chest. Across the street, an elderly couple was slowly crossing. The man supported his wife with shaky hands, his gaze filled with tenderness. Walter watched them, his eyes following until their silhouettes vanished behind the bus stop. Then he turned away and kept walking. Slowly, one step, then another, like a man learning to walk again after a fall. Far too deep. A third-floor apartment. In an old building on the other side of the city. There was no balcony, no spacious kitchen, no laughter echoing at the end of the day or motion sensor lights in the hallway. Just a single bed, a mini fridge, and a man sitting silently by the window. Walter Evans had walked away from everything. Within just 2 hours of the will reading, he brought nothing but a small suitcase, a few changes of clothes, and a silence so heavy it felt like it could crush the air. Day 1. He powered on his phone and set it on the table. The screen lit up, 0 missed calls, no message asking, "Are you okay?" No email from the attorney, no word from relatives, neighbors, or even the people who used to call him Uncle Walter whenever they needed a faucet fixed. Only a spam discount ad and a text reminding him to top up his phone credit. Silence. Walter ate a pack of instant noodles without much thought, then sat in the metal chair by the window. Outside, the skyline rose in frozen silence. Nothing moved except for flickering yellow lights, like the fading flashes of forgotten memories. Day 2. Walter didn't shower, didn't shave, not out of neglect, but because he wasn't sure who he still was, to make grooming matter. The neatly folded dress shirt in his suitcase still had crisp creases, but he didn't put it on. Because that shirt, Margaret used to press it for him every morning. Now it was just a cold piece of white fabric lying in a drawer no one would open. He opened the fridge. 2 cans of water, 1 carton of milk, about to expire. He let out a small laugh. Not loud, but sharp enough to sting inside. I rebuilt the Langford home's entire plumbing system, and now I can't even give myself a proper meal. Day 3. A neighbor knocked on his door by mistake. Walter opened it. They stared at each other for 3 seconds. The person said, "Sorry, wrong room," then walked away. No one knew his name. No one recognized the face that had appeared in countless family photos. Always at the edge. He didn't cry, because this kind of pain had no tears. It didn't sit on the surface. It lived deep beneath the skin, beneath the bone. In that place where the only voice left asked, "Has anyone ever truly needed me?" Walter stood up, reached into the pocket of his coat, pulled out a few old receipts, a worn parking stub, a coin, and one folded slip of paper that he always kept tucked in an old shirt. A line of handwriting in purple ink. "Thank you for always being patient, M." The M was slanted, slightly crooked. Margaret's handwriting from the early years of their life together. Walter looked at it, as if clinging to a piece of driftwood in a freezing ocean. But then, he folded it back and slipped it into his pocket. Because he knew, thank you, without action, is just the softest way of walking away. He sat down on the bed, back against the wall, 3 days. Not a single call. The apartment was quiet. Still, but in that stillness, he understood something clearly. No one was coming to save him, and no one was obligated to. If he wanted to find himself again, he'd have to get up, on his own. Morning of the 4th day. The sun rose behind the old apartment blocks, its light paper thin, gently inviting a new day. But for Walter Evans, it felt no different than the 3 days before. Silent, colorless, meaningless. He was still sitting by the window, holding a glass of water that had gone cold overnight. Eyes weary as he watched cars drift past on the street below. No expectations. No one was coming. No one ever had. Then, a knock at the door. Software very soft. Exactly 2 taps. Walter frowned. No one knew he was here. He rose, walked slowly to the door and cracked it open. The hallway was empty. No footsteps, no voices, no one in sight. Just one thing on the ground. An envelope, no stamp, no postmark, only one line handwritten in dark blue ink across the front. For Walter Evans, private. Walter froze, because he knew that handwriting. It was Margaret Langford's, the same hand that once wrote notes for the fridge, signed birthday gift tags, and had scribbled "I love you" on a slip of paper tucked inside his lunchbox for the entire first year they lived together. His hand trembled, not from the cold, but because something inside him was cracking. And it might be everything. He closed the door gently, as if carrying something sacred. He didn't open the envelope right away. He placed it on the small wooden table, stared at it for a long while, didn't even dare to touch it at first, because part of him feared that opening it would only confirm the final rejection. But then he inhaled, slowly, deeply, and drew out a small letter opener from the drawer. The blade moved cleanly, softly, as if the envelope had been waiting. Inside, two things: a handwritten letter and a smaller sealed envelope with a note on the front. "Open only after you've read this." Monsieur Walter shivered. The air in the room seemed to stop moving. He sat down, opened the first letter, blue ink. Hurried strokes, some parts smudged, either from water or tears. "Walter, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And maybe you're wondering why I let you walk away like that. I beg you, please read this to the end before you judge me. I had planned to leave everything to you. The house, the shares, all of it. Everything we built together. But the kids came to me before I finalized the will. They threatened me. They said if I gave you anything, they would sue. They'd smear your name, drag you through court, called you a gold-digging handyman. I was furious. I yelled. But Walter, I was scared. Not for me, for you. You shouldn't have to fight at your age just to prove you loved me. So I did the only thing I could think of. I made two wills. One fake, to show them their true selves, and one real, to give you everything, exactly as you deserve." Walter lowered the letter for a moment. His heart was pounding, but this time not from abandonment, from being seen. He closed his eyes, and the questions that had tormented him for 3 days began to dissolve. She didn't betray me, she protected me, in the most painful way possible. He opened the second envelope. Inside, a copy of the real will with signature and notarization. Deed transfer papers for the house and shares in Langford Holdings. A bank card with an official letter confirming a personal account in his name. And finally, a thick document with embossed lettering, the Evans Trust, a scholarship fund for stepfathers. Walter bowed his head to the table, not in despair, but because, at last, he had not been forgotten. Walter Evans sat silently by the wooden table, the early morning light casting soft shadows across one cheek, hollowed by sleepless nights. In front of him was Margaret Langford's handwritten letter, its lines still trembling, uneven, and smudged at the corners, as if her breath still lingered on the page. He inhaled deeply and continued reading. "Do you remember the first time we fought? It was over the broken water heater. I was upset because you wouldn't call a plumber. You insisted on fixing it yourself. But when I saw you, shirtless, shivering in the cold outside at midnight, I understood. You weren't fixing it to save money. You were fixing it because you believed a man should be the last to give up. All these years, I never said this enough. But you were the reason I knew I was worthy of being loved again. Not for my past, not for my 3 children, but for me. With all my cracks, my failures, and every wound still healing. You walked into my life not to rescue me, but to stay, even when no one asked you to. And that was the kind of love I'd never had before. Not flashy, not loud, but steady, enduring, like your hands, always strong, always there." Walter sat still, both hands resting on the letter but not gripping it. He didn't cry, but his eyes began to glisten. "I know. When you walked out of that law office, you must have thought I betrayed you. I know. The way Vanessa looked at you, the way Eric smirked, the venom in Bryce's whisper. It must have felt like a sentence with no appeal. And the cruelest part is, I let it happen. Not because I wanted to hurt you, but because I wanted you to have peace. Walter, if I'd left everything to you publicly, they would have dragged you into court. They would have twisted every truth, branded you an opportunist. I saw that look in their eyes long ago, But you hadn't yet. And maybe I wasn't brave enough to face it either. Walter leaned his head back and looked at the ceiling. The letter in his hands trembled slightly, not from rage, but from pain. Confirmed. Margaret hadn't been blind. She had known, she had seen, and she still chose to carry it in silence. You once told me something I've never forgotten. Love isn't a promise. Love is presence, when no one's forcing you to be there. So if you're still here, if you're reading this, then this is my final presence. For the only man who never left. I'm not leaving behind an apology. I'm leaving behind a second chance. One that no longer locks you inside the shadow of my family. I created a charity, the Evans Trust, for men like you, stepfathers, unsung protectors, men who entered someone's life and chose to stay without needing recognition. Walter folded the letter, not because he wanted to stop reading, but because his heart needed a moment to recover. A while later, he opened it again to read the final lines. And if you still want to do something for me, then use everything I've left you to make sure men like you never have to die in silence again. I love you, even if I never said it enough. Always. Monsieur. Walter pressed the letter to his chest. His breathing grew short, not from exhaustion, but because for the first time in many years, he felt truly, wholly loved. Without conditions, without needing to prove himself, without needing permission from any of her children. After 3 cold, hollow days of being left behind, Walter Evans reached for the second envelope, not with excitement, but with a trembling hesitation. His hands shook not from cold, but because he knew what lay inside wasn't just a fortune. It was the meaning of an entire life, measured not in numbers, but in worth, in the pride of a man who had never once been acknowledged. He opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a carefully notarized set of legal documents, not just the paperwork of ownership, but a doorway to a new life. Laid out before him were the real will, signed and sealed by a certified notary, confirming that the entire lakeside vacation home, the investment portfolio in Langford Holdings, and the remaining family assets had been officially transferred to him. The deed of ownership, certifying that the property now belonged to Walter Evans, the very land he had built up, brick by brick, stone by stone, with tireless care. A bank card, accompanied by a letter verifying the transfer of assets into a new account in his name, granting him full control over a lifetime's worth of silent labor. And finally, a thick file embossed with these words: the Evans Trust, a scholarship fund for unrecognized stepfathers and guardians. The printed letters flowed across the page like a quiet declaration that even if the world had only ever called him her man, Margaret Langford had recognized his true worth. From the depths of her soul, Walter closed his eyes. In that moment, what sat before him wasn't just paperwork or inheritance. It was a bold, quiet statement. I am not merely the heir to a legacy. I am the one who helped build it, with my heart and with unspoken sacrifice. He slowly laid the documents, the card, and the asset files down on the humble wooden table in the bare apartment. To anyone else, they might seem like mere numbers. But to Walter, they could never fully express the value that Margaret had seen in him all along. And in his mind, her voice echoed gently, if wealth is made of tangible things, then gratitude and human dignity, they are eternal. And in that moment, Walter felt a strange, quiet relief. No longer the disregarded one, no longer seen as the undeserving shadow riding the coattails of a family name, but instead a man who had been seen, not for what he was worth on paper, but for the legacy of character and integrity that he carried in silence. His eyes caught a rare flicker of light. Like sunlight piercing through clouds after a violent storm, he realized that no matter how cruel life had seemed, in Margaret's heart he had always been someone special. Someone who had every right to stand tall, to serve as an example for other stepfathers, for all the uncelebrated protectors society so often overlooked. Every stamp, every signature on those pages wasn't just a legal formality. It was a promise, a guarantee that from now on, Walter would never again be the nameless one. He was now a man with pride, a man with recognition, a man whose worth had been etched into legacy. Through the twin forces of love and gratitude, this was not a turning point of revenge, not a reclaiming of wealth, but a quiet revolution, a redefinition of value, because character could never be summed up in a number, and through the Evans Trust, Margaret had left him a mission worth living for, to help those the world tends to forget, to be seen, to be valued, and to be genuinely loved. Out loud. The small apartment remained as silent as it had been for the past 3 days. No doorbell, no voices, no knocks at the door, but this time, inside that silence, something had shifted. Walter Evans sat motionless in the wooden chair beside the old dining table. In front of him, Margaret's letter. Beside it, the real will, the property documents, the file for the Evans Trust. Everything he hadn't dared to hope for now rested quietly within reach. And in that very moment, after all the holding back, the swallowing of pride, the days spent completely forgotten, he cried, not loudly, not with screams, not with dramatic head-clutching like in the movies, just his hands trembled, he covered his face, and the tears began to fall. 1 drop, then 2, until his time-worn face was soaked, not from grief, but from the slow unraveling of a man who had held too much in for far too long. Walter had never cried in front of Margaret, never cried in front of her children, never allowed anyone to see him break, because he believed a man is the last person allowed to fall apart. But today, he gave himself permission to break, not because he had been abandoned, but because he had finally been seen. Each tear was for every silent dinner he sat through with patience, for every time he fixed the roof in the rain and no one said thank you, for the night he sat alone on the porch, listening to Margaret cry in the bedroom after her 3 children didn't come home for Thanksgiving, for the word dad, a word he never once heard, despite doing everything a father would do. And now he cried for relief, because in his deepest moment of despair, Margaret had not forgotten him. She had loved him, in her own way, quietly, strategically, sacrificially. Not with grand speeches, but with a second will drafted in secret, with a charitable fund bearing his name, with one final act to help him live again. Walter pressed his face into his hands, tears slipped between his fingers, dropping onto the surface of the old wooden table. The room hadn't changed, but the man within it was no longer the same. He was no longer the afterthought in a will reading, no longer just her man. He was Walter Evans Dash, a man who had been loved, believed in, and entrusted with a legacy worth carrying forward. And in that moment he whispered. No one heard it, but no one needed to. "Thank you, Margaret, for not letting me disappear." Walter Evans never returned to the law office of Terence Holloway. He didn't file a complaint, didn't post anything online, didn't call to confront the 3 stepchildren. No lawsuits, no demands, no vengeance. He chose to begin. On the following Monday morning, Walter walked into a small bank branch on the south side of the city. In his hands, a letter confirming the account from Margaret and a full legal file regarding the fund she had established, the Evans Trust. The bank clerk flipped through the documents, eyes wide. "You're the primary beneficiary of this entire fund." Walter smiled, not proud, just steady. "I'm not an heir. I'm someone who was trusted." 9 days later, the Evans Trust officially launched. No ribbon cutting, no press coverage, just a simple website with an opening line, "For the fathers who were never called Dad." For those who stood behind the curtain but held up the entire stage. And then the applications began to roll in. Not from businessmen, not from scholars, but from people just like Walter. A bus driver who'd taken his wife's children to school for 7 years, but was never once invited to a parent-teacher meeting. A school teacher who had raised his late wife's 2 children for a decade, and was never called Dad. A veteran raising his brother's grandchildren after addiction tore the family apart, but never saw his name on a single year-end award. They came, they wrote letters, they sent thanks. For the first time in their lives, they were seen. Walter didn't give speeches. He quietly read every file, signed every scholarship, shook every hand. He looked into their eyes, and in those eyes he recognized something he had seen in his own reflection for decades. "I don't need to be famous. I just want to be understood." One afternoon during the Trust's first advisory meeting, a soft-spoken, brown-skinned man sitting beside Walter asked carefully, "Why didn't you use the money to live the rest of your life in comfort? Buy a big house? Travel the world?" Walter simply smiled, his gaze drifting to the window, where sunlight hit the edge of a whiteboard that read, "Mission Dignity." He answered, "I spent a lifetime in a house no one believed belonged to me. Now I just want to make sure. The next man doesn't have to live like that." Walter was no longer the quiet figure beside a wealthy woman. Now he stood as a symbol of something money could never buy: the value of presence, even when no one applauds it. He continued living in that small apartment for a while longer. He didn't change his address, didn't change his number, but every morning he opened his laptop. Every afternoon he called back the names on every submitted application. And every night he placed Margaret's letter beside his desk, like a lighthouse in the dark, reminding him, "I was right, and now it's time to help others believe that too." A quiet Wednesday afternoon. The neighborhood was still, as always. The cream-colored house on the corner of Fairview Lane sat silently beneath the flaming red maple trees. The white wooden gate swayed gently in the autumn breeze. This was the house Walter Evans had once painted, fence post by fence post. The place where he had installed every doorknob by hand. The place where he had lived for 25 years, and yet had never once been called the owner. Vanessa Langford stepped out of her new model SUV, the click of her heels crisp on the stone walkway. She wore a beige business suit, holding a thick set of documents tucked neatly in a brown leather folder. Behind her came Eric Langford, muttering into his Bluetooth headset, "I still don't get why we have to show up in person. A simple notice of possession would have been enough." Bryce Langford was last to enter, grinning as he carried the real estate contract he had prepared a week earlier, looking as if this visit was just a belated move-out party. No one knocked, no one called ahead, no one thought they needed to, because in their minds it was already settled. "This is our house." But when the gate opened, Walter Evans was already there. He sat in the old wooden chair he had fixed countless times. Beside him, a tray with hot tea and a thick black leather folder placed squarely at the center of the table. He wore a simple white button-up shirt, collar fastened, sunlight catching the gray streaks in his hair. His face was calm, no bitterness, no tension, no urgency. Only one thing shone in his gaze: the quiet resolve of a man who has nothing left to prove. Vanessa stopped first. You're still here?" Walter lifted the teacup, took a sip, and replied softly without looking at them, "I never left." Eric let out a short laugh. "Clearly you haven't read the will properly. Mum left this house to my sister." Bryce raised the folder in his hand. "We've got a meeting with the realtor on Friday. We're just here to give you a heads up. If you could clear out in the next 48 hours, that'd be..." Walter set the teacup down, so gently it didn't make a sound. Then he opened the folder before him and flipped to the very first page. "The will, you know, was the one Margaret left for you to see." He looked directly at all three of them. His gaze wasn't sharp, it wasn't heavy, but it was clear, like a mirror. "The one she left for me was the real one." No one laughed anymore. No one said a word. Vanessa stepped forward and snatched the folder from the table. Inside it were a copy of the second will, fully notarized, the property deed, now in Walter's name, full ownership documents for his shares in Langford Holdings, and finally, the formation certificate for the Evans Trust, signed by Margaret herself, with Walter listed as founder and director. Eric took a step back, color draining from his face. Bryce opened his real estate documents, then glanced at the ones in Walter's possession. Everything was legal. Everything was final. Walter didn't smile, didn't raise his voice, didn't gloat. He simply stood, slowly, and spoke as if teaching them something their parents had never made clear. "Money? You might inherit. But character? You have to build that yourselves." No one replied. Only the wind whispered through the red maple trees and the soft rustle of paper in Vanessa's trembling hands. As if that will wasn't just Margaret's final word, but her final judgment. On the three children who once thought they were the rightful heirs. The front yard of Walter Evans' house was still, as if time itself had paused. On the tea table, 3 porcelain cups remained untouched. None of the 3 visitors had taken a sip. Vanessa Langford clutched the will so tightly her nails tore the paper's edge. Her face had gone pale, lips pressed tight, like she was holding back a protest even she knew would fall flat. Eric Langford was no longer smug. He leaned against the porch railing, eyes darting nervously, as though trying to reshuffle a deck, with no cards left to play. Bryce Langford was the quietest of all. His eyes were fixed on the folder labeled The Evans Trust, while his hand gripped a real estate contract that now meant nothing. And between them stood Walter, calm, no raised voice, no smirk, just steady eyes moving across each face, as if, after 25 years, he was finally seeing them for who they were. I used to think, if I just lived kindly, eventually people would understand. But I was wrong, because kindness, when it's never acknowledged, is just a shadow easily erased. He took a step toward the table, lifted one of the teacups, not to drink, but to gently turn it in his hand. I don't need to reclaim anything, because I never took anything in the first place. I'm simply keeping what Margaret left to the one she believed deserved it. Vanessa finally spoke, voice dry and brittle. "So, what are you going to do with the house? The shares? The trust fund? Spend it all on yourself?" Walter looked at her for a long moment. Then he answered slowly, clearly, striking at the heart of the matter. "Money may be an inheritance, but character is the real legacy." No one replied, because that line wasn't a statement. It was a verdict. No judge, no court, no attorney needed, just truth. And it rang so true that none of them had the courage to argue. Walter set the teacup back on the table, pulled out a chair, but didn't sit. He looked at them one last time. Not as a man who won, but as someone who had learned that dignity doesn't require victory. "I'm not banning you from coming back. This house holds too many memories, and nothing I do can erase you from them. But if you do come back as people who know you were wrong, not to apologize to me, but to start again, with your own sense of character." Vanessa lowered her gaze. Eric's hand tightened on his briefcase. Bryce turned away, eyes stinging with shame. They left without saying a word. None of them dared slam the gate. They only closed it gently, as if they too understood that the next time they returned, they might not be welcomed in. On the porch, Walter sat down and looked out at the yard. The soft amber light of late afternoon brushed across the steps. He reached for the folder labeled The Evans Trust and opened to the first page. Beneath the simple logo was a mission statement: to empower those who quietly held a family together, even when they were never truly considered part of it. Walter nodded faintly, not because he was satisfied, but because he had held on to himself, even when no one else did. 1 month later, the house on Fairview Lane no longer echoed with the click of high heels, the voices of attorneys, or the sound of torn contracts. It now held only one man. A man who had chosen to live again inside the very space that once denied him. Walter Evans rehung an old photo of Margaret Langford above the fireplace. Next to it, he placed her handwritten letter, laminated, set in a simple frame. Not ornate, not displayed like a trophy, but like a final promise. "Walter, I'm sorry I didn't have the courage, but if you're reading this, then you know. In all the days I had left, you were the kindest thing I ever had." Beneath the letter, the fire in the hearth crackled softly, not to warm the room, but to keep the flame alive for a memory, the memory of a man once forgotten, but who had never forgotten how to be kind. On the desk in the study, applications for the Evans Trust were stacked high. A 58-year-old school security guard raising his orphaned grandchild, a bus driver who used his own money to buy books for students, an electrician who had never been called Dad, but still woke at 5 a.m. every morning to drive his wife's children to school. Walter read each letter, line by line. He missed nothing, because he knew these people were like him, not in age or job or circumstance, but in one quiet truth: they had chosen to be kind, even though no one ever asked them to be. Through the window, the last rays of daylight slipped through the curtain, falling across one small object on the bookshelf. A white porcelain teacup, lightly chipped at the rim. Margaret's teacup. Walter lifted it, poured in hot tea, and sat by the window. There was nothing left to rush, no one left to prove anything to. Only a quiet mission, carried forward from the same silence he had once endured. At the gate, a young brown-skinned girl approached with her mother. In her hands, a handwritten envelope that read, "To Mr. Evans, Evans Trust Scholarship." Walter opened the gate, bent down, smiled. "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea?" "Here. Everyone is welcome." Walter Evans never raised his voice. He never begged, never fought for a place in the will. He simply walked away and left behind a lesson that echoes long after the room fell silent. Not everyone who gives you life will love you, and not everyone who loves you will ever be truly seen. But some still choose love anyway, quietly, faithfully, until the end. If you've ever known someone who gave everything and was forgotten, if this story reminded you of a silent parent, a stepfather, or someone who never asked for praise, leave a comment. I saw them, and they deserve to be remembered. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, about dignity, about justice, about people who mattered even when no one said their names, subscribe and join us each week to remember what truly matters.